Hi Year 8s, I'm just going to give you a bit of information on medieval warfare through this video, just to set you up for our next class. I want to give you as much time as possible to work on the worksheet that I've got for you. It is a fairly big worksheet. I want you to feel confident coming in that you'll get that done on time. You won't have to complete any at a later date. So I'll get started. So medieval warfare, basically to break that down, it's any wars or battles that occurred during the Middle Ages. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, how that happened, and to what extent that affected the way of life in the Middle Ages. So many destructive wars were fought during the Middle Ages. However, nothing like today's firepower existed in medieval times. The destruction that was caused by 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki show what modern technology is capable of. So if you're not aware, at the end of World War II, America dropped atomic bombs onto Japan to try to stop the war. Japan had allied itself with Germany, and they'd attacked Pearl Harbor, and as a response, America dropped atomic bombs, and it was the most devastation that one attack had ever seen on a city, within a battle, anything like that. So when we're talking about battles in the Middle Ages, these sort of wars were fought very differently to what we see today. Even if we're talking about things like guns, even tanks, those sort of weapons, none of that existed during the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, wars were fought literally through clash of arms with swords and axes and maces. There were instances of large-scale massacres. Christian knights slaughtered thousands of Turks when they took the city of Antioch. The Tatars used trebuchets to fling disease-ravaged bodies over the walls of the city of Kaffa. This allowed them to kill many people with sickness. The invention of gunpowder, originally from China, changed the way battles were fought. In Europe, guns and cannons were developed from the early 14th century. Medieval guns were at first ineffectual, so not effective, because they were very slow to load. They were inaccurate, and they were actually liable to blow up in the person's face. Archers with longbows and crossbows were more effective, but by the end of the 15th century, gun technology had improved, and they made the way that people fought during the Middle Ages pretty redundant, so no longer relevant, didn't work anymore. So I wanted to show you an example of a medieval weapon. So this is called a trebuchet. The trebuchet was a kind of giant slingshot designed for hurling rocks at enemy armies and fortresses. Sometimes other missiles were used. So what I was just saying before, the Tatars used trebuchet to fling disease-ravaged bodies over the walls into the city of Kaffa. So you can imagine the effects that might have if you were having people that you knew, possibly, or people that were on your side who had passed away, diseased, or people or they'd gone over into enemy lines to fight and they died, being flung back over into your city or into your area. This demoralized the enemy. But if it was a diseased body, then it usually spread disease among the population, because often a trebuchet was used to aim at a besieged population. What that means is a population of people that have holed themselves up in a castle to protect themselves from an invading enemy. And so if you had dead animals or slain enemies thrown in, then you've also got this issue of disease spreading, and we know that can happen quite quickly. Now, this is a medieval illumination, so it's a form of artwork showing the siege of Antioch in 1098. The knights in this illumination resemble the soldiers from 2 centuries after the event was depicted. So this happened in 1098. This medieval illumination was actually created in about 1298 or 1300. So the soldiers in this picture look like they're from the year 1300. In some ways, this would be like depicting a soldier from colonial Australia as a modern Australian infantry soldier. Medieval artists were not historians, and they often painted historical scenes as if the event was happening in their own time. Now, this is really important because we are going to be analysing works of art, and it's important to understand that just because something is depicted a certain way, it doesn't mean that's how it occurred. Remember that artists are people. And like my presentation is telling you, artists are not historians. So it's not necessarily true that the artist that made this piece of art in 1300 knew exactly what those soldiers were wearing during the siege in 1098. They might have had no idea. And in fact, looking at this picture, it's likely they didn't have any idea because they've painted all of these soldiers that are supposed to be living in 1098 as soldiers from 1300. So I want you guys to keep that in mind, that when we're looking at pieces of art that are depicting things that happened, events or famous people or that sort of thing, you need to be really critical about whether or not it is an accurate source. And we're going to be doing quite a lot of that in history this year. Now back to medieval battles. So medieval battles were terrifying experiences. Anyone observing a battle from a short distance would have heard yelling, screaming, and the clash of steel on shields. This would have been noisy in the thick of battle, but from a distance it would not have been very loud. This is because modern artillery did not exist to create that horrible ear-splitting noise that you hear if a gun goes off, or, hopefully nobody's heard it in real life, but a tank or something like that. When we listen to that happening in movies, it's really intense and it can give you quite a shock. Because modern artillery didn't exist back in the Middle Ages, it wasn't that loud from a distance. So fighting hand-to-hand, medieval armies tended to battle in tightly grouped formations. One side would push against the other. Infantry stabbed and slashed each other with swords, axes, pikes, maces, and even farming tools. It was the job of mounted knights, so knights on horseback, to charge these formations and try to break them up. The bloodshed was horrific. Limbs and heads were chopped off, I'm sorry if you've got a weak stomach, and brains and guts were strewn across the battlefield. The tight formations meant the soldiers were likely to stumble over the dead and the dying. By the end of the battle, which did not usually last longer than an hour, the battlefield was covered with gore and blood. The ground was littered with the bodies of both men and horses. It doesn't sound very pleasant. Now I've got here for you, this is an extract from a text that was written in 1314. Sorry, I don't think it was written in 1314, but it's from a chronicle describing a battle that occurred in 1314, the Battle of Bannockburn, when the Scottish rebel leader Robert the Bruce defeated the English, who sought to control Scotland. So if anyone has ever seen Braveheart, the movie, which I highly recommend watch with your parents, but it's very, very good. It's about William, who wanted to give Scotland its independence from England. Robert the Bruce is in that movie as well. So he was a Scottish rebel. He defeated the English because they were trying to control Scotland, and Robert ended up becoming King Robert I of Scotland. So this is an extract. I'm just going to read this out loud for you. The two hosts came together, and the great steeds of the knights dashed into the Scottish pikes as into a thick wood. There arose a great and horrible crash from rending lances and dying horses, and they stood locked together. So you can see it really doesn't sound very pleasant at all. And this is from a chronicle that's describing what was happening at the time. Now, I haven't looked into whether or not this chronicle was written in 1314 or a little bit afterwards. But if it was written a little bit afterwards, we might need to be quite critical about whether or not it's correct. To be honest though, it sounds pretty correct. It sounds like what would be occurring in a battle. Now, for those who died in battle, there were no war cemeteries and there were no pensions for wives and children. Nor were there any entitlements for disabled veterans, of which there would have been many, many people. A beggar's bowl was often the only means of survival for the medieval common soldier who was crippled fighting for his lord or king. So although we see pictures of knights, we see pictures of battles or movies with battles and that sort of thing, it looks fairly exciting, exhilarating, scary, of course, but this kind of, it's almost heroic in a way. But often what you would find with all of this bloodshed, if you were a soldier that survived, the chances of you coming out of a battle unscathed, so with no marks on you, no injuries, no disabilities afterwards, were very, very slim. So the population of soldiers, of knights, would have been I don't think as able necessarily as what we are thinking. Of course, there were knights that were able. There were people that did succeed in that sense and didn't get impacted physically by the fights, but they were few and far between. So it's important to look at cause and effect. How did this actually impact these battles? How did they impact the people of the Middle Ages? And of course, keeping in mind, many families were reliant on the mail. to provide money, to provide shelter, to provide food. If a male was killed in battle, that left a wife and children. If they were disabled in battle, then that would also leave a wife and children with no breadwinner for the family. So yeah, not a super pleasant time, have to say. Okay, so you're going to complete a worksheet in class based on the information that I've laid out in this video for you. You're going to then start an online activity designed to inform people about one popular medieval weapon. Now, that second task, that is for people that finish the worksheet on time, that want to do something a little bit extra, a little bit more interesting and engaging, that sort of thing. Oh, not that worksheets aren't engaging. All of it is important information, but the activity will give you a chance to be a bit creative and explain some of the information that you've come across, do a little bit of research into something that I find really interesting. I think medieval weapons are really interesting. So you can check Schoology for details on the task and just let me know if you need a hand with anything.